1,000 better
1,000
stories.
better stories.
1,000 better stories.
1,000 better stories.
You're listening to 1,000 Better Stories, the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network's podcast sharing stories of community-led climate action in Scotland to help us all imagine the better and fairer future and transform what we think is possible.
My name's Katie Revell. I'm a podcast producer and I'm also a member of SCCAN's Story Circle and the Storytellers Collective. This past year, I've been working on a podcast series together with the Nordic Alliance of Artists' Residencies on Climate Action, or NAARCA for short. It's a network of 7 art institutions across the Nordic region and Scotland, and they're all working together on their response to the climate crisis. The series is called Testing Grounds, and it features conversations between artists, activists and researchers on a whole range of topics. Things like amplifying young people's voices on the climate crisis, reducing waste in art installations, decolonising the art world, rethinking urban design, and the role of Inuit values in democratising decision-making around climate action. You can listen to the series by searching for Testing Grounds in whichever podcast app you use. I also produced a bonus episode of Testing Grounds, and we're going to hear that shortly. It features Mairi MacLeod, a Glasgow-based writer who works in both Gaelic and English. Mairi is going to be sharing the English and Gaelic versions of her short story, Seasickness, or Cur na Mara. It's a piece that NAARCA commissioned her to create. In Seasickness, Mairi draws on a traditional Scottish folktale, the Selkie Wife, and she updates it for an age of climate crisis. You can find out more about NAARCA at naarca.art. I hope you enjoy the episode.
My name is Mairi MacLeod and I am a writer from Glasgow, writing in both Gaelic and English.
Mairi was commissioned by NAARCA to create a short piece of fiction in Scottish Gaelic with an English translation. Along with Scots, Gaelic is one of Scotland's 2 Indigenous languages. It used to be the most widely spoken language in Scotland, but now only a small part of the population speaks it. But there's a growing interest in how Gaelic language and culture can help us build healthier relationships with the land, with ecosystems, and with each other. Mairi took inspiration for her writing commission from a well-known Scottish folktale, the Selkie Wife,
which is a story that comes in many different forms, lots of different iterations across Scotland and across generations.
Selkies are mythical beings that can shapeshift. When they're in the sea, they live as seals, but they can also come onto the land. By removing their seal skins, they can take on human form.
I've always been really inspired by these folkloric aspects of storytelling, especially in Scotland. So I wanted to write a story that reimagined the tale of the Selkie in a kind of context of changing seas, changing coastal environments for the current climate.
Are these stories that you grew up with?
Definitely stories that I grew up with, but the Selkie one in particular, when we were growing up, my sister and I had a book called Stories by Fireside. And it was a collection of different stories written by Shirley Hughes, famous children's author. And I had these beautiful illustrations of it. And the Selkie story just always really stood out to me because it just made me really sad, but it was also quite scary. The illustrations were quite dark. So I always kind of saw it as a dark, sad story. And yeah, that's kind of where I first heard about the Selkies. But then as you get older, you kind of realise that these stories are kind of everywhere in Scotland, but that's where I first kind of got into them. I wrote the story when I was at the Sari residence in Finland, and I was there for 2 months, which was an absolutely magical, inspiring time. And I wrote that kind of being inspired by the natural environment around me, even though we were in kind of the forest, surrounded by trees. I was just thinking about these kind of stories that you tell around the fire Not that many of us do that nowadays, but that would have been told around a fire. And the time at Sari was just absolutely incredible. It's a kind of place where you kind of lose all concept of time and space, and you're just in a complete bubble away from the quote-unquote real world, and you're surrounded by interesting people, you're surrounded by beautiful landscape, and we had snow for a good chunk of the time that we were there, probably about a month of snow, and I've never seen snow like it. Whenever anyone asks me how was your time, I just say magical, because it truly was.
And how did that actually come about that you went to Sari?
So last year I took part in a residency at Cove Park, one of the other partners of NAARCA, and that was a young Gaelic writers residency. So I was at Cove Park in Argyll for 2 weeks. So very different from 2 months. So that was a kind of snapshot of what a residency is like. And post Cove Park, I was given the opportunity to take part in the NAARCA exchange programme for creatives who kind of produce work that comments on climate-related issues. So that's how I ended up at Sari. At Sari, there were, I think, 9 of us in total, 9 artists, creatives. We built up a really strong community and we all kind of helped each other, and I was really inspired by all the work that all the other artists were doing, and I think without having that contact with them, I probably wouldn't have produced the amount or the kind of quality of work that I did produce. So I think that's a really important aspect of residencies in general, but in particular Sari's done a really good job of kind of facilitating that.
And can you tell us about how you actually got to Sari?
Yes, so rather than flying to Finland, which would have probably taken about 3 hours, I travelled via slow travel. I was very lucky to get funding for that from the Coney Foundation, which fund Sari. So how I travelled was via Glasgow to Edinburgh, down to London, Eurostar to Brussels, train to Hamburg, train to Copenhagen, train to Stockholm, and then the final leg of the journey was the overnight ferry from Stockholm to Turku in Finland. So it took me about 5 days, I think, in total, and that was doing it as fast as I could do it. Even though it was slow travel, it still felt like it was all happening very fast, and before I knew it, I was at Sari in a little cabin. So yeah, that was pretty cool. You just get little tasters of culture along the way, whereas when you travel by air, you get on a plane at point A, you come off at point B, and you've got no kind of concept of all the places that you've passed over in that time to get from point A to point B. So I think it's just being able to get tasters of a city and of a place. It makes sense, the kind of changes in culture along the way. Yeah, I would recommend for anyone to try and travel like that if it's possible. I know it can be difficult in terms of money and also time, but it is a really kind of special way of travelling.
Why is it important to you that you work in both Gaelic and English?
Writing in Gaelic, I think, is important for me in 2 ways. First, personally, because it's the language that my family have spoken, people that have come before me, like my granddad, my Shenar in Gaelic, he wrote in Gaelic as well. And for me, it's kind of like keeping on that family legacy, but then also there's the kind of wider cultural legacy. And I think particularly when you're writing about environmental issues, it's important to understand that cultural sustainability is just as important as environmental sustainability. And that's kind of a hot topic in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. And if I can contribute, even though I'm a Glasgow Gael, if I can still contribute to sustaining our language, then that's really important to me. And I hope that I can continue to do that and really play a part in keeping the language, but also the culture alive.
And you mentioned a moment ago that NAARCA were specifically commissioning artists, writers who are engaging with environmental issues, the climate crisis, whatever term we want to use. Why is that something you're interested in? Why do you engage with that in your work?
It's kind of always been present for me, that kind of sense of justice for the planet, justice for animals and non-humans, but also justice for people in general. And I think growing up, I've always had that. And it kind of started from like a love of animals and really caring about endangered animals. And then as a teenager, you kind of learn more about climate and global warming and stuff like that. And it just kind of developed as an interest over the years. I went on to study geography, which kind of ties in the social and the natural sciences. So I did that at university and did a master's in a course called Earth Futures. So it's always kind of been something that's interested me. And I think that in terms of tackling these issues, to really get to people's hearts, being creative and producing creative work and artistic work that does that is really, really important, because technological solutions can always go so far, but if you really want people to change, then you need to pull at the heartstrings a little bit, in my view.
Here's Mairi reading her story, Seasickness, first in English and then in Gaelic. Even if, like me, you don't speak Gaelic, I'd really encourage you to listen to both versions.
Seasickness. Cur na mara. The pair walked hand in hand along the sand, their anoraks zipped up tightly. It was spring, and the sun was battling with the clouds and just about winning, but the wind from the sea was fierce and chilly. Ava, recently turned 6 years old, was restless and bouncy. It was the Easter holidays, which meant she was more excitable than usual as a week with her grandparents stretched out before her. The sea sighed in and out, breathing gently. "Look, what's that over there?" Ava shouted, letting go of her granddad's hand and bounding over to the rock pools. He followed on slowly, the torment of a dodgy hip hindering him. It was becoming more and more difficult to keep up with her on their escapades, and he tried to push the reality of the inevitable to the back of his mind. These days were far too important to him. "It's a bird," Ava shouted back at him, dropping her litter picker to the ground and crouching down. When he finally caught up with her, his heart dropped. It was a gannet, entangled in netting. "Stay back, Ava," he said, knowing the birds could be aggressive. It was alive, thank God, but its wings and webbed feet were pulled tightly to its body, stopping it from moving, and it was flailing its head around in distress. A resourceful man, he took the pliers he kept in his jacket pocket and began to snip the netting, holding the bird's bill shut with one hand to avoid injury. With every snip, the bird's wings began to flap, until eventually the netting came completely loose. Slowly, the man let go, and the bird took flight, disappearing up into the rock face. Ava grabbed the netting with her litter picker, examining it closely, then stuffed it into the black bag. "Shenar, if we didn't find that bird, would it have died?" she asked. "It may well have," he responded, "but luckily you and your eagle eyes were on the case." 4 years earlier, a sperm whale had been found on the beach in Shelbost. They said it had 100 kilograms of litter in its stomach when it died. A big ball of human waste,
just sitting inside its body. He'd had to hide the tear that streamed down his face when he saw it on the news, for fear his wife would call him an old fool. That was when he'd started doing the beach cleanups. When Ava was no longer wobbly on her feet, he'd started taking her with him. He didn't like to get too sentimental, but it was difficult when she came along. Being a parent had been a minefield, learning what to say and what to do. But being a grandparent, it was different. He got to give her the best parts of himself, and in return, she gave him hers. But he couldn't help but wonder what kind of world she'd live in long after he was committed to the ground. When their bags were full, they laid a picnic rug on the sand and sat side by side, watching as the waves beyond advanced and retreated gently. They wolfed down the well-earned sandwiches, made with the care of a wife and grandmother in the morning. "Will you tell me one of your stories? Please, please, please," Ava exclaimed, licking the remnants of homemade raspberry jam from her fingers. Okay, come and sit close to me." The man gazed out to the sea and thought of all the stories it had to tell. Well, there was once a young fisherman who had heard the tales of the seal folk, the Selkies, and how they came ashore and shed their skins. A man of logic, he considered himself too wise to believe such fairy stories. That was until he saw her, dancing and singing on the beach one summer's night, her song wistful and alluring. Her hair was as dark as the deepest corners of the ocean, her eyes as black as the night sky. Her sealskin was neatly folded on the rocks. Enticed by its shine, he swiped it and hurried home with his treasure. Soon after, the young seal woman appeared on his doorstep. "Please, sir, I can't return to the sea without my skin," she pleaded. But he would not give her back her skin. Instead, he asked her to become his wife. Now, she had no desire to marry this strange man, but with the magnetic pull of her skin so strong, she was bewitched. And so she accepted, knowing she would one day take back what was hers and leave him lonely and feeble. But the years passed, and she did not get her skin back. She scoured the house longingly, but her attempts were futile. The couple had a child, a girl, and she loved her dearly, but she missed her seal family in the sea. She would sit at the window gazing out at the ocean, thinking of them every day. The fisherman grew agitated and cruel as his yield of fish depleted and time bounded on. Men came from the south with their innovations and their noise, drowning out the soothing songs of the birds. Then fish came aplenty, dragged en masse from the sea, and so did the money. The seal woman's husband brought her a solid gold necklace, as though her obedience and her love could be bought. 2 decades passed, and the seal woman's sorrow grew stronger and stronger. One dark autumn night, her daughter, herself now a gallous young woman, came to her. "Mother, I think I've found something that belongs to you," she said, carrying a large package wrapped tightly in plastic. Knowing exactly what it was, the woman leapt up in joy. She unwrapped the package and the sweet, seaweedy smell of the skin enveloped her. She ran through the village, barefooted, in her nightdress, and down towards the sea, ready for its welcoming arms. When she reached the sand, she turned back to see her daughter had followed her. She gave her a final kiss as tears fell down her daughter's cheeks, the saltiness a blessing on the woman's lips. She ripped the gold necklace from her neck and placed it in her daughter's hands. "Sell it and get away from here," she said, letting go of her child's cold fingers. "Mother, please don't go." "I have to go, my child. I'm going to be with the sea, where I belong." She wrapped her skin around her as she walked slowly into the salt water, awaiting the familiar metamorphosis. But her shape wouldn't change. She swam out with the skin heavy and cold on her back, knowing the currents would soon embrace her. But the sea, it had changed. It was not as it had been before. It was warmer, emptier, lifeless. Her skin wouldn't mould to her body as it had done before. It blistered and began to wither, losing its elasticity. An angry wave came and lifted her, depositing her at the water's edge like scrap. She lost her grip on her decaying sealskin and the currents whisked it away from her. She shivered as she watched it float like a carcass out to the horizon before disappearing out of view. "Have mercy on me," she bellowed to the waves. "Let me return home." But the sea just roared back at her, ignoring her pleas. Birds cawed as they circled in the night sky, mocking her. She sang for her seal family, but heard nothing in response. They were gone. And so, she was sentenced to a life of misery on land, unable to return home. She made a shelter in a cave by the sea where she lived alone, vowing never to return to the man who had stolen her freedom so many moons ago. She watched on as the beaches were littered with debris and rottenness took hold of the sea. Some say that on the wind you can still hear her singing her tormented song, longing to return to the sea she once knew. Eva turned to her grandad with a look of disapproval, narrowing her eyes. "That's not how the story goes, Shennar. She gets to go back to the sea and lives happily ever after with the seals and brings her family on the land lots of fish. We learned about it in school." "Well, sweetie, the thing about stories is they are always changing," the old man said. "Just like the world around you. The story's yours now, and you have the power to change it, and so will your grandchildren after you." "Well, I like the one Miss Macaulay told us better," she declared matter-of-factly. "Your one was too sad." "You're right," he said with a laugh. "It probably was." Eva rose to her feet, then danced across the sand in her wellies. She spun round and round, twirling her litter picker like a baton. "Come on, the beach isn't going to clean itself," she said, offering her grandad her hand to hoist him up. On the horizon, a seal poked its head above the water and watched them intently. Cur na Mara. Seasickness. Choshichin G Shaka Cola Iriganavich, and Shakachin Chown Mumboikin. Shen Cherach of Own is Vagrian a Burnachug on the Hounds Bachelor in the Skohen, a hast Vagun a Mare Fiachis Fur. Va Eva a Vagirach Becken is Shia Bliana Gush a Bocketich from Kurst. She third lie in the cash gaveln is vai Tollychuk and no fat shach in eich gecoleria Shennar. Va vur a gosnach gesocher. Shall, Jia shit, yev Eva, a lekker as en tina a weiche son skutal hokal, is a jeruigen nog in de krekken. Lenin schaun dunje I gesluitoch, pien a gruach en a gopperer. Vai fast na stulia is na stulia ja, kumal suusria is loos na hoike eiche. Omo grach, she ian a haun, jev Eva. She suler vaun, is vai rock down in liene choriking. Glúis rash, huirste, lán esig ag gymbiag na chiona va seo fiaich. Vai bio tangt o ie ach vai skiahan is a chasin glaster I voig. Vai volle shocken noi an in aching is a chiauna dol vo huv getuv a fiachin I fein kuitjes en lean. Hukken schaun dunje gremere as a fokach, maar gunje lav garoch vai in coni jishels on suichug some bi. Hoshich garug en lean, a kumal greimer gop en jon agus nach bichach Me jurk hal hoshi skiahan en jon a klappig is hutch en leaner falav a lukeleer. Gesluitoch lekken dunje en chian as is jeriger eachak dal machasalig uit in de krikke. Rein Eva grat greem in leen, gasgrutig, is hilke jan fokke woord duweike. A hennar, maar beek schiener in chian shenne larik, en beek het basig, jynigi. Stoche, rekker shennar, na gevies tainkel guno usa aan. O hun keer bliene ga muk vare sputoch a larik een traik shellbost. Huursak gerokiet kilogram skutel en breine stomach. Bol moor trulish, jirach a suye na voik. Jalichen botoch in jier a hut shies ute nur a hunnike shin in de neochen. Saun ik almshin a hoshike a krunnichu skutel van trai fashgore. Nu de va Evan is kindje a kassin, hoshike gatorst kolerish. Onnerukigi vai fast nas me eintnige. Nu de va clown ikke heen ook, vai vi fiachin in de rielten iumsachug. Je begoria janu is je nach begor. Ach vai vina to henar etter jalitje, is apper geron laien gelle ikke heen is Eva kolle. Ach cool einching, va kishin ikke min chorsche sul aan some fasig isje suus, vatte en je ja heen a dol jantalu. Nu de van de bakken en achgelaan, huyat er some picnic er ganavich. Jich iat na kepper in de wakke, iat er een ulchugli gulm na is shenneverse vatting. A hennar, een isje go ferry in de skeelch genakket, machette holle, jeef Eva a gimmelig shili van de kork en eike. Troot me ha ledi, is troot na sashgorum. Rein Eva shin, a gol greem er a shennar, is gasokrhug heen na garstenen. Geld en dunje en maagjan vuur, is munjechug in de skeelchen a wekke die isje. Uriken, va eersker alkaun, waar skeelchen a kleinching mo vuintjen den roon, na selkies, is maar a hieke giat gunne glattig, is maar a hilike giat de krakning. Dunje nach eeste gristorien schie nog, waar heen fatter o glich er son de ruttensjen a gritching. Shin gus een vakke isje a dauser en trai een uige houdi. Vai is shine, a horen eiche bien agus kuach. Va falt go dorach rin na hatchgen as duine se chuan, is a sulin go duurish an aar va os an kuun. Krek, va an krachking roon eiche a faske gekurmach. Roon iesker gremer, is galavelish. Chapeluja va chilig jache leis a krachking a noch gen borrenoch eiche goris. Chanúri go chile jan vuur is asunish mo krachking, jevi. Ach a torige rasje, a nache shin huge tarik se fossi ye. Neshe, chro ishe iche regerian dunje sho a fossig, ach va tari na krachking ho lacher, agis dan beshit en doye sasse eine rash, jene gie. Huurstigen posige ye, ach va laan is eike gun chichige jachi go loose buringi, ga akel under noch agis lak. Chain de bianich shachet, is ga door de weitjen roon gremere krachgen eike. Goiat die se goede haatje a geroi aan. Verpaasje ik a koepel. Nien, agis van borre nog laan gragi. Hoshi hi fuse a vinas messele in dunje eike. A geroon gul lief gelaatjer se weier son een tjulig eike ik mur. Huigi ik een unjak a shouting in de vuur, a smunjig ook mijn jane a hulle la. Gasen tieske jumpach or haroi glachkig moor an eisk. Hiekige jachi gruemach is bij isje a jemig delike glis a goed sheriffetish. Goed na hiesker in barach vatig in a mach gemur. Han ik viervol jes li inalen is fuum, a bahig oren kuun den ian. Anish, va pouches eiskaun, scoopje vo grunt na mare, agis pouches arikich. Hukin tiesker sheet munal or javnui, is a lan en doog en bunja a geoshoch is a mahanis a janoch. Chai fichet liane shachet, is va braune weitchen roon haar smoorn. Ach een eiche ugger, hanike nien eiche huike, e heen en nish na bornach ook njog joutach. Na garstenen va package voor soorntje aan een film plastic. A vaher, ha me ruttiger en lorik, is ha mi smunchen graun latse a hai. Leem en bornach lanes eiche jevaun. Raki en package foscoche is huri en falig salche milish. Rwy tronfalu cas rwgje is sias gun na mare, vai jishal. Voi hi gurno ni an eiche lenting. Huki poki is at se hutch na jord sias a hutun, van saling mad bianoch liepen a vaitchen ron. Repi en shene oor vo havich, is kurian en lavin na hine Reik shaw, is cheekamachis shaw. Chanjam mi a gerig yn falavu a vam. Slaan lat, a grai, ha mi a chilig jan vur far an bun mi. Chwrien crachging chimicha ore is chosi hi gysluitoch jan iske a fihu son an ahrach hi. Ach a vur, vai ahrachug, vai nas blaie, nas alue. Chagoig yn crachgan na shavoi geike. Hosi ke a bullock na chug is a shachgug, a cawl a hoobaljoch. Hook town mori ga chilical gachir. Chawli greimer a crachgan is glach na sruene, ga fluitog a falla vwoepe. Choyat flot mar chlosoch, is farre a dol a machas shellig. Gian trocher orm, lek go chilig yachi, jeve vatchen ron. Ac va vur giroch a bekal rash gyn a vigal fiashti. Is mar sin huir I bín bethe ar tír. Raini áte fasci I hén an an gioa ag a chlatoch fan an tíga gan níon eiche a chéli ore. Ach a jachi yachi gan dunne eiche tulug. Yn ferrigat se cwtch syrse blianig yn y rash. Hwnnw na traen y lianig li scutal is li sprwylach, is leif chachas a gal tarish a chwyn. Ha fein y gra gan kleinu a hor an haast ar a gwy, is I a giwnta mwyn na mare. Giwnta Eva is choiat I a shenar li sŵlan gyr. Chanaw mar shen a hans gealach a dol a henar. Ha I chilig an fwr, agos ha I tolitje, lyn y ron ele, agos bi a tors tor eisg don trylach eich ar tír. Iwsig si ma jens yn skol. Wail metal, ha sgealach yn coni a gaharachug, ricker yn dunne. Dierach man zoom en koerstoch, orst. Ferti to kaus en bier janulish en skeelach, san latse a haien ish. Well, a shar limse en story a yees misnik al laigain, va en che aketse rov ronach. Lekken dunje mach gare, hau kjarste grai, a torst pok hier kaun, she a va. Jedig Eva Noorshin is gaunsi harish, ganavich ans na boten en eike. Troot de hennar, hursty, femishin kumalarn. Churie mach a lav hukke is le kutchukuk hesen shaun dunje. Ik a muik mur, noch kaun ron as kjone nuske, a kumal sul giar ore.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and share it with others. It'll really help us reach a wider audience. If something exciting is happening in your own community, be sure to let us know so that we can help you tell your own story. You can drop our story weavers a line at stories@scan.scot. It's scan, SCCAN, .scot, SCOT. We also offer training and mini grant support to community storytellers. To keep up to date with our offerings and everything SCAN, check out our website at scan.scot or find us on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram, or simply sign up to the newsletter.